Okay, moving to the next speaker, Dr. Maria Isabel Pereira de Silva from Universidade Católica Portuguesa from Portugal. It's presentation about patterns of stigma in people with pulmonary tuberculosis.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Isabel. I'm presenting Maria's work today. And first of all, we'd like to thank the honor to be here presenting for everyone. And let's proceed with the presentation. We are talking about patterns of stigma in people with pulmonary tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is defined by an infectious disease that is contagious in its pulmonary form. As we can see in the global population, women are more affected by this disease from the age of 15 to 34, and men from 25 to 54. And in the Portuguese population, older generations tend to be more affected by this disease, and the disease is barely significant in 14 years or younger. To fight tuberculosis to be successful, it is crucial that the stigma and discrimination associated with this disease to be recognized and combated. This is one of the key social determinants of health. But what is social stigma? Stigma is a concept created by the Greeks to refer to bodily signs through which they sought to highlight something extraordinary or bad about the moral status of those who presented them. While the stranger in front of us, evidence may arise that he has an attribute that makes him different from others, being even a less desirable species, dangerous or weak, reducing him to a spoiled and diminished person. Such a characteristic is a stigma. Stigma in tuberculosis. Stigma in tuberculosis is referred to as one of the factors that negatively interferes with treatment adherence, potentiating treatment abandonment, increasing the risk of developing drug resistance, causing greater severity of infection. As a social phenomenon, often influenced by organizational norms and behaviors, it interferes with people's quality of life and well-being, leads to shame and fear of rejecting, motivates isolation and social exclusion. Its persistence is one of the barriers to healthcare. The objectives of this study were to identify patterns of stigma in people with pulmonary tuberculosis in Portugal. The methodology and procedures. We made a quantitative study with a convenience sample consisting of 303 people with pulmonary tuberculosis under treatment or in follow-up from pulmonary diagnostic centers in the northern region of Portugal. The study and its procedures were approved. The data that was analyzed was with a statistical package for social sciences for Windows, with a confidence interval of 95% and a margin error of 0.05. That was collected between February 2019 and January 2020. All ethical and legal assumptions were met. The instrument that we used was the tuberculosis-related stigma scale, TRSS. It was a scale constructed and validated in Southern Thailand in 2008 by Van Rijn. It consists of 23 items distributed in 2 dimensions. The first dimension is composed of 11 items related to community perspectives on tuberculosis. And the second is composed of 12 items related to the person's own perspective on tuberculosis. The first 11 items is the person's with tuberculosis perspective on how the community perceives tuberculosis, and the second is the person's own perspective. This is the instrument. and it's two major groups, A and B, A being the perspective of the community, B, the own perspective. The scale was created in southern Thailand, and due to great cultural and linguistic differences between Thailand and Portugal, the original scale underwent several linguistic adaptations to better suit the Portuguese language and culture. This scale was also previously translated in Brazilian Portuguese, but due to some linguistic and cultural difference, it was also decided that the translation will be made to European Portuguese. This scale was translated to Portuguese and later translated to English and published in a science magazine. The adaptation and validation to the Portuguese language and culture was performed in a sample of 204 people with pulmonary tuberculosis, following the guidelines suggested in international and national literature. We had a global scale on the community perspectives of 0.91 and on people's perspectives on people's perspectives of 0.92. We consider these results very positive. The two dimensions of the TRSS show the good internal consistency. As we can see, the original version had 0.82 and patient's perspective of 0.92. Our version, it had the community perspective of 0.91 and patient perspective of 0.92. The TRSS translated and adapted to the Portuguese population had an overall consistency of 0.94, being classified as excellent. Therefore, we believe that this is a reliable instrument capable of measuring stigma in people with pulmonary tuberculosis. As for the results, we identified that most people with stigma in tuberculosis were between the ages of 30 and 69 years old, with basic education. In Portugal is the lowest grading, the lowest education possible that you can legally get, that were married and professionally active. As for the results, to determine the stigma patterns, we chose to standardize all scores to a 50-point scale. This is the formula that was used by the original author of the scale. And considering that n is the number of items, the subscale being calculated, and 4 is the minimum value for any item in the scale, the standardized scores range from 1 to 50. In the total population, there is always stigma. We identified two groups: low stigma, under the mean, and high stigma, above the mean. As for the cross-tabulation results, these graphs are in Portuguese, but I can translate as we go. The green row is 30 to 49 years old, and the red row is 50 to 69 years old. As we can see, either low stigma or high stigma, low stigma being the group of 4 rows on the left, and high stigma, the 4 rows on the right. The frequency maintains itself independent of age, and it's both in low stigma and high stigma, pretty high, independent of the age group. This pattern maintains when we look at the sex of the patient. Once again, low stigma on the left and high stigma on the right. Orange being females and blue being males. Next up, we have the stigma and education. Blue is basic education, beige being secondary education, and red being high education. As we can see, stigma maintains itself once again, meaning that independently of the education that the person, stigma is still present in all education levels. and the same maintains to professional situation. Blue being active, yellow being retired, red being unemployed, orange student, and the right blue being other professional situations. Lastly, we have cross-tabulation between stigma and family status. Green being married, yellow being legally united but not married, purple being single, red being divorced, and blue being widowed. As we can see, once again, independently of the familial situation, the patterns of stigma maintains high in any familiar situation. Regarding the discussion, data from the Instituto Nacional de Estatística in Portugal shows that the disease continues to affect more men than women. The study also suggests that a biological predisposition of adult professional active men, low education and fragile economical status to become ill with pulmonary tuberculosis. Data released by WHO, the notification of tuberculosis globally in 2017 was higher in men than in women, with an average of 1.8 male cases for every female case. Our study shows that 40.9% of participants fit the parameters of the pattern with low stigma, while around 60% of the participants fit the patterns of high stigma. Studies developed identified more than half, 52% of the participants had high stigma associated with tuberculosis, while ours is around 60%. People with tuberculosis face deep and persistent stigma, and its impact is extensive to a different social context, such as home, workplace, community, resulting in serious impact for people with tuberculosis. Stigma and discrimination are also factors that contribute to a low adherence to the treatment. It can delay an individual attendance to appointment and cause greater damage to health of the patient and people in the community. To conclude our presentation, studies in the literature have discussed the role of stigma and prejudice as process that hinder people with tuberculosis from adhering to treatment. Several studies in the field show that stigma has emerged as one of the main social determinants of health. The presence of stigma, even if in a subtle way, effectively compromises the adherence of a sick person to treatment, and it has a direct and significant implications on the control of this disease. National and international guidelines need to be aware of this phenomenon and realize that its dimension and how differently it is perceived and experienced by both men and women. In addition, interventions aimed at reducing stigma must take into account the relationship between stigma and all other existing cultural constructs. The study contribution to the discipline is that it's the first of its kind in Portugal, and it provides us relevant information that can be used in the process of planning and managing the care of people with pulmonary tuberculosis in Portugal. This study may also contribute to the decrease of the number of new cases in order to achieve the proposed goals by the Direção-Geral de Saúde, that is to reduce the incidence rate of tuberculosis in all ages and both sexes to 12.1 cases per 100,000 inhabitants by 2030. Recommendations for further studies. The findings in these studies could be compared and strengthened with results from future nationwide studies. We also consider that it's appropriate to consider all studies directed to non-tuberculosis population in order to access their actual perceptions regarding stigma in tuberculosis and not the patient's views on how the disease is perceived by other people. Here are the references used in our study. And to finalize, we'd like to present you with a phrase. You are either valuable or contagious. Society stipulates the means that label people, leading the way to social stigma. That is all.
Thank you, Dr. Isabel, for your interesting presentation.